Quem ainda não tiver um texto pode pegar ali na frente da mesa.
O site também da jornada. Esse é o reportado de hoje. O site da jornada. Esse tem
Bom, então, acho que a gente pode começar. I would like first to thank Professor Mao very much for coming and accepting the invitation to do this seminar and the closing lecture of the Congress. It's truly an honor to have you here, and I can't be thankful enough for you enduring all the hardships of São Paulo to be here with us. So I will just remind that Professor Mao has made his promotion, his PhD in Köln, and he has also grounded the Intercultural Society of the Society of Intercultural Philosophy. And so, thank you again for being here, Professor, and please feel free to start the seminar however you feel fit.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be here with you. I think something is wrong.
Está mais baixo.
I'm really happy, very happy to be here. Some 2-3 years back, I met Lucas at the University of Vienna. And there was one international conference of the Society of Intercultural Philosophy, which I founded with some of my students in Calcutta. And now it is 26th year. And in our talk, for the last 40 years, I've been teaching in Germany. And intercultural philosophy or intercultural attitude, for me, is not an intellectual category, not only an intellectual category. It is existential for me. Existential in the sense that majority, nearly 90% of the European philosophers, they hardly understand anything, say about Indian philosophy or non-European philosophy. But still they have the guts to tell their students philosophy is Greek and Greek only. And particularly those European philosophers who hardly know anything. They have not read Indian philosophy, even not in translations. They tell their students philosophy is only Greek. And those who have studied Indian philosophy, whether in original or in translations, they of course, they are sober and they say, yes, there is something like philosophy. So before, the trouble is I have the habit I can talk and talk and talk for the last 40 years. So if you have any questions, you do ask me. I simply wanted to tell you how I came to intercultural philosophy. The moment I did my doctorate and my habilitation, which is a must to be a professor in Germany. Anyway, after that, the moment the students saw my face, they always told, oh, we do Indian philosophy. And I just told them, there is no Indian philosophy at any university in Germany. And not only in Germany, Indian philosophy as philosophy, Indian logic as logic, is not a part of any philosophy department in any Western university. And this is sad. And then I told, I have got my professorship for European philosophy. I did my doctorate Hume and Kant, and my habilitation Hume, Kant, and Husserl. And this was the reason I somehow, with my students, thought, let us do something. Philosophy is nobody's possession all alone. Philosophy has no one mother tongue. It has so many mother tongues, you know. It is not only Greek and German, as Heidegger minted. So this was the reason that I was more or less in a very sad position and also very angry. But I thought this won't help me if I just get angry and do nothing, because these professors at the university in Germany, they're more powerful. It won't happen. And that's why I started with this. Of course, teaching European philosophy. And this society now has nearly all over the world. And you saw there. So before I start how it really came to this, in the 70s, I wanted to write my habilitation thesis on experience and reason. Hume, Kant, William James, and Husserl. That was the topic for my habilitation thesis. And I nearly finished it in 74 at the University of Cologne, where I was working as a part-time assistant at the Husserl archive in Cologne. Landgrave, the last assistant of Husserl, was my doctor father. And he said, it's all right. You can submit this as a habilitation thesis at the university. But there is another professor who must also say yes, otherwise it won't work. The other person was the son-in-law of Heidegger. His name is Volkmann Schluck. So once, and this is a real story, it has already been published. My colleagues just wanted me to make it public, you know. So I just went into his room, and then I just told him, sir, I did, a few years back, I did my doctorate, went back to India, taught at the University of Cologne for some time. Again, I'm here. I have worked on this topic. And very humbly, I just asked him, would it be possible if I submit this thesis as a habilitation thesis in this university for philosophy to become a private docent and whatnot? You know, this German habit is peculiar. It is good and bad at the same time. But anyway, and then he just imagine. And now I quote him what he said. He just looked at me and then said, it's all right, you did your doctorate here in Germany, that's all right. But how can you, I'm quoting his words, wie kannst du, that was the German, how can you, being an Asian, understand the spirit of European philosophy so well that you can do your habilitation, become a private docent and professor in Germany? I just thought, my goodness, this is a rhetorical question. The answer is already given. And those were the days I was reading Habermas and all that, you know, of free discussions and should discuss up to the end. And then I thought, you must give some answer to this man. And that is, sir, but you just imagine, there are Indologists, Xenologists, you know, they are Europeans and they have written very good books. So if European mind can understand non-European mind, the hermeneutic must go the other way around also. You know what happened? He stood up, went to the door and told me, you can't do your habilitation here at this university. And this is the experience, this sad experience is the reason why I came with my students to found such a society. So, because I thought, if I start fighting and throwing the child with bathwater, oh, all these Germans are nonsense, all that, they won't help me. So just I tried to cook my frustration in such a way that something would come out of it. Yeah? And that is more or less the very existential situation, how it came to that. In India, I would have never thought about it. I would have done my Kant and Hume, and that's all. But the very one-sidedness of European philosophy, and that is for the last so many years, from the Greeks up to, even up to today, that that I thought it has to be made public. And this is, this will be also our topic. The saddest part of it is even in the United States, hardly any university has Indian philosophy, Indian logic as a part of philosophy curriculum, Asian studies and all that. And the trouble is the Gadamer, one of the very famous philosophers. I taught at the university where he taught, Heidelberg, just 2 years. And in one of my talks, some 15 years back, I wrote a book. It's in German, 3 birthplaces of philosophy, China, India, and Europe. And there is one chapter, reductive hermeneutics of Heidegger and Gadamer. This hermeneutic is reductive, it's too European. And then he's a very nice man, and his command of language, Gadamer, is so beautiful that you forget the content of it when you talk to him. And then he told me, you just come to me, let us talk. And then he just clapped here to me and said, oh, you are the Indian colleague who has criticized my hermeneutics as too narrow. I said, and he was smiling, So it was a bit this way and that way. Then I told Professor, no, how can I dare to criticize your hermeneutics? Only the model of your hermeneutics in the multicultural situation today is not wrong. It is too narrow. Because your hermeneutic tends to be too European. But how can you then understand just from the Indian point of view? And then he told me, but Indologists and those who know Sanskrit, they tell us Indian philosophy is more or less religious. And then I said, would you accept, sir, the judgment of a teacher of German language at a German university? So if a Germanist, German language teacher at the university passes a judgment on Kant's critique of pure reason, would you accept it? No, we would say no. And that is what is happening for the last so many hundreds of years, that Indologists who are doing more philology. So if Indologists can talk about Indian philosophy properly, why don't you allow to the German teachers to talk about Hegel and Kant? And this is what is really happening. And the saddest part of it is that Indian philosophy and logic, they have been philolized too much in European countries. It has become a part of Indian culture. So European philosophy could also be part of European culture. But that is not the case. But anyway, that will take too much of time if I start talking like this. No, we come to.
But I think actually that brings a very interesting point to discussion, because earlier in the Congress, yesterday, we were just discussing, I believe Carlos was the one who asked this question about precisely the point that when we talk about literature, for instance, or other fields, when we talk about religions, literature, it has already been recognized for a long time that Eastern traditions, non-Western traditions have a very rich culture and production in those fields. And yet, for some reason, only philosophy still resists to this recognition. And we were talking about how the reasons for that, as you say very often in your texts, should be extra-philosophical and not exactly philosophical. But then the question is, what do you think that are the extra-philosophical reasons that make it so that even when all the other areas already study Eastern cultures or Eastern productions, philosophy still remains closed within this very Eurocentric approach?
Yes, and we know that the two Greek historians, Lucian, I think Lucian, Germanish, Lucian von Samosata and Diogenes Laertius. second and third century historians of philosophy. Lucian of Samosata, he says, the queen of philosophy was born first in India, then in Ethiopia, and then in Greece. That was one point of view. And Diogenes Laertius, who became more powerful in the historiography of Western philosophy, he said, no, philosophy is the invention, an achievement of the Greek mind, and not of the barbarians. These two views were there, but somehow, because of the political and other situations, the view of Diogenes Laertius became more powerful. And this view became more powerful later on due to the political, colonial, imperial, say, rulings in India or in many other countries. You would wonder, Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras University, these three big universities, were founded by the British people, 1800 something. Calcutta University, where I have studied. In Calcutta University, British people, they started nearly all the subjects were being taught, but no Indian philosophy in an Indian university. There was no Indian philosophy and no Indian art and music. Even today, you can read the reason why not. The reason is philosophy is only European and not non-European. So we can't teach Indian philosophy at any Indian universities because there is no Indian philosophy. And then came the question, music and art. You just imagine. And now came the Victorian mind, and they just said, Indian art is, I quote, Indian art is far too erotic to be taught at the university level. Just imagine. And it was the British people, they dictated what subjects have to be taught. And this is how it happened. After independence, of course, now Indian philosophy is being taught. There are universities, Sanskrit University in Benares, Varanasi. So they are doing a lot of Indian philosophy. But majority of the universities in the British days, we did just European philosophy, and out of interest, one did Indian philosophy. And this is how things happen. This is also what happened even in African cities and nearly all over the world. That the saddest part of is that with the help of colonialism, imperialism, European philosophy somehow succeeded in not accepting the non-European elements in philosophy. And intercultural philosophy, what we try, intercultural philosophy, as we see, it is not a particular type of philosophy. It is a way of doing philosophy. That means it is not it is a branch of philosophy as its anthology or metaphysics or something like this. It is a way of doing philosophy. And a way of doing philosophy means philosophy is nobody's possession all alone, whether they are Indians, Chinese, or Europeans. And this thing has to be taken. But the moment you have the attitude of doing philosophy in an intercultural spirit, then you don't ontologize philosophy. That means you don't put it in a geographical or cultural context. And this is practically, philosophically, a nonsense to say you can philosophize only in one particular language. And this is what really happened, that you can say from the days of Alexander the Great and even Columbus. So the things were more or less European. And the non-European ways of doing things, they never succeeded. Not because they didn't want to succeed, but because they had no power. Indians had no say in Indian politics, Indian history, and all that. But anyway,
I was thinking that, well, you mentioned this fact that the British were the ones that actually dictated what would be taught at the universities. And I think this could be a a good pretext for you to talk about a little bit about your idea of the fourfold hermeneutics, because this shows how the situation has shifted today, and how there must be why there should be a different approach, an intercultural approach, when we think about this fourfold hermeneutics.
You know, that is, let me talk, I have somehow found out for myself that hermeneutic is a four-way road. And this fourfold hermeneutics, I think it is also
Yes.
somewhere it is there now.
Yeah.
You have it. Do you have it somewhere?
They don't have it.
You have only the Portuguese translation. Anyway, this is. But anyway, I'll come to that. Yeah, will come. You know, what I talked about before that, you see here, I've just written, I just want to read out this sentence, which is important for us. Intercultural philosophy is not a matter of aesthetization. You know, that is what is happening particularly. Without doing metaphysics or psychology of yoga, it has become a practice just on the road, and it is nonsense. You know, it's not a bodybuilding. But anyway, this we leave it. Now, intercultural philosophy is also not a matter of aesthetization. Oh, let us do some Indian philosophy. Let us do some Chinese philosophy. It's not an aesthetic matter. You know, the non-European can also do aesthetics with the European. It must not be confused with cultural romanticism and exoticism either. That is why a word of caution is needed here against the long-lived, romantic, exotic, and mostly amateurish interest in all that is non-European. So it was an interest which was not really intellectual, which was not really religious. Indians do not have philosophy in the only genuine Western sense of the term. And now I quote here, their answers are not really answers to genuine philosophical questions. Here, but Indian philosophy, he added, and that is Gardner, he added, and he wanted to console me, is full of wisdom, wisdom. This is the trouble. You know, Indian logic, Buddhist logic is far too powerful. You know, the dialectic of Nagarjuna is far better without thought cannot solve its own problem ultimately through the help of thinking. And that's why Nagarjuna has only 4 negative answers. They call it Chatushkoti, you know, 4 negative answers. The positive answer is beyond language, beyond logic. You know? And Hegel, of course, finds out the solution. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Although the synthesis is never there in practice. But the trouble is these things were not done. And the saddest part of it, the students are not informed. And that is the saddest part of it, because it is you who can do something in this aspect in the future. And that has to be done. And now we come to this 4-fold analogous hermeneutic. That is the term I used in some of my books. You know, if you see the history of philosophy or the cultural encounters, then what happened? Europe, the European mind understands itself. And that is a type of self-hermeneutics. Europeans interpreting, understanding themselves. You know that famous sentence of Hegel, non-Europeans can't understand us. And we Europeans, Hegel, we Europeans understand non-Europeans better than non-Europeans can understand themselves. And this is really a very adamant attitude. You know? And this was also one of the reasons politically that British people wanted to stay so long in India till the Indian culture comes to age. And this is one way. So these are called self-hermeneutics. European mind, understanding European mind. This is the first part of the fourfold hermeneutic. And then the hermeneutic of the others, European mind as it understands the non-European mind. This is the second one. And now I just turned it down the other way around, non-Europeans, and by that I mean all non-Europeans, so to say, non-Europeans understanding themselves, their self-hermeneutic, how Indians understand themselves, their philosophy, their religion, their culture, their language. And then the fourth part, non-Europeans understanding European mind. It hardly happened because the Europeans were they ruled the world more or less. No? So the two these are the fourfold hermeneutics. And this is what is happening today for the last, say, 50, 60 or 70 years. That non-Europeans are there who are writing books on Hegel, Kant and Husserl. Yeah? Then all of a sudden, Europeans think, my God, do they understand us? European mind could, but otherwise it was not. So since the political situation is not there, so at present, the post-colonial era, things are completely different. Africans will tell you, come on man, that is not what we think. No? That is you, what you thought. And that's why there is a lot of protest at present. And this fourfold division. Now, what I fight for, maybe it is, for you it is the future, for me it is too late. But anyway, we have already started. That it should be taken on the same level. You know? It is not the problem, the trouble is, normally my colleagues told me, but European philosophy is very rational. I said, come on, that is nonsense. European philosophy is also rational, not only. It's just Plato and Aristotle, David Hume and Descartes. No? These are just two opposites. So European philosophy, Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophies, these are constructs. No? There is no one European philosophy. There is also no Indian philosophy. Which philosophy you mean? Buddhist or the Hindu philosophy? No? So in the same way, if you know, in one of my seminars, it was very interesting for the students. I just told you, see, Buddha and the Hindu orthodoxy. They were just, Buddha said there is no Atma. No? And the Hindu metaphysics says there is. No? And this is very much similar to David Hume and Descartes. You know that? Descartes and David Hume, they just used more or less the same method. No? And they were in search of finding the soul, cogito, no? Which is unchangeable. And you just imagine, and David Hume writes in his criticism of the Cartesians, he says, Descartes and Cartesians, they close their eyes and ears and they search the immutable, unchanging soul and see, they find one. They find one. There is one. David Hume says, I also close my eyes and search the immutable, unchanging soul. I don't find him. That is the bundle theory of soul. Human mind, human soul is nothing else but a bundle of changes. There is no unitary one self. And then David Hume says, it may be that Descartes and Cartesians are right. They find one unchanging soul. But so am I. So am I. I too. I don't find. And the trouble is, the moment you say European philosophy is the philosophy cogito ergo sum, that is one-sided. David Hume is also a European philosopher, William James, and so many others. The same thing happened in India also. And this is what, the philosophical problems, they have a type of, the German word which I use,
Yes.
The German language is sometimes in a way better, because we have formed words like Sanskrit, So it is a type of philosophy is situated, unsituated. In German, the word I normally use, orthhafte Ortlosigkeit. That means the moment philosophy takes a particular form, concrete form, then it is situated. It is in India, China, in Germany, France, or anywhere. But it is unsituated in the sense that philosophy proper is not exhausted in any one particular language country. And this is the unsituatedness. And the trouble with the European philosophy is it became a matter of geography or a matter of culture. And this is the criticism which is very, very important. And there are philosophers who are busy with this problem, and this can only happen if non-European philosophy is taught, of course critically, is taught within philosophy departments, within the curricula of European philosophy departments. Only then it will be on the same path. Otherwise, it will be just a matter of language studies and religion and whatnot. And that won't do. That is really sad.
Also, regarding this, what you said about this claim that European philosophy is allegedly original or more original than any other thought, we already had a talk here today on Parmenides and the East was the theme of the talk. And one of the things he said was precisely that if you study the Parmenides period and the texts that were being written or the context in Greece and India, it's not entirely sure. You can't even tell who influenced who, but because it could be that the Upanishads had an influence on Parmenides or the other way around. And either way, I guess it doesn't really matter what is the answer to that, but that already says that at the very root of Greek philosophy, so to speak, there's no such uniqueness, such a thing that only developed in Greece. I think it's very interesting to see how even, I get the feeling that always when you try to convince someone that there's not only that there are Eastern philosophies, but also something of value in those Eastern philosophies, they keep withdrawing and trying to find something that is legitimately, uniquely Greek or European, which justifies that European philosophy has a privilege. Like, no, but Europeans, it might be that the East has some kind of wisdom or some kind of conception, metaphysical conception of the world, but they don't have a concept of reason, for instance, or they don't have a concept of substance, or they don't have whatever kind of concept that for some reason then becomes a way of justifying that Greek thought is unique and thus it's the only one that can be called philosophy. But again, we were also talking about this book from Ganeri, which is about India. The book is called The Proper Work of Reason, Philosophy in Classical India. So it also seems to be, it's very interesting this way, even if you have different contexts, it's very much difficult to find anything specific to that context, which would legitimate saying, no, you see here we have something unique, this makes us better because this is something that you have nowhere else. This is very problematic, I think.
That's what you said. The trouble is the philosophical sin lies in the fact that we essentialize philosophy. Essentialize means we identify philosophy with one particular language, culture, tradition, and whatnot. And this won't do. You just imagine, in the eyes of the very staunch analytic philosophers, Heidegger is no philosopher. Hegel is no philosopher. For the analysts, just I read in Bertrand Russell's book, Bertrand Russell is very wise, History of Western Philosophy. And he writes the word Western philosophy. Otherwise, majority of the books on history of European philosophy, they are called history of philosophy, not history of European philosophy. And the moment you write a book on history of Chinese philosophy, then Chinese, the adjective, Chinese is there, or the adjective Indian is there. And Bertrand Russell says, the absolute spirit, I quote, the absolute spirit of Hegel is a myth. It's a myth, you know. European philosophers say it's a myth. That means within the European philosophy, there are philosophers of rank. They say, oh, they are no philosophers at all. And this you have to extend if you do philosophy in the world context. And this may happen anywhere. And this, I personally feel, the homelessness of philosophy is its richness. Because the moment you give philosophy one home, and that's all, then of course you try to find out within Europe, where is the home of philosophy? Who is the real philosopher? Parmenides or Heraclitus? You just imagine, who is the real Indian philosopher? Buddhist or the Shankaris or the Advaita Vedantis? No? Both of them are philosophers. And that is, in Europe, the students were always wondering. I told one of the seminars, I told, leave India. Let us imagine Hegel and Schopenhauer in Germany. They come out of their grave and they just talk to each other. Now it is given. Hegel would say, Schopenhauer, that is no philosophy. What you do in no philosophy? And you know, Schopenhauer would say, come on, what you do in no philosophy? So Schopenhauer would be happy sitting in Varanasi in India, and would be happier with the Buddhists then, and he would be very, very unhappy at home in Germany. That you see the philosophers, whether they are of European mind or the non-European mind, philosophy as an attitude, as a type of theory and practice, is nobody's possession all alone. So you see Hegel and Schopenhauer, they fight at home, having the same language, same culture, same religion, is still they are fighting. And such fights were also in China, in India. And this is what the Europeans, the moment they were outside Europe, they forgot all the difference at home. And that is very political, you know. With that you can see, and this is what really happened. That politically, that Ganelli uses the word, colonial reason is still not dead. Colonial reason. And that is more or less still the case. So normally with these students, I always did, you see the trouble is of the same sort. When you talk about European philosophy, there are European philosophers, they say, no, that is no philosophy at all. Then all of a sudden it is said, no, but if you want to do philosophy, you must take the help of a particular language. You know, that is Greek or Sanskrit. You just imagine, if language structure determines the structure of my thought, then of course there may be different structures and different patterns of thought within the same language. Buddhists and the Hindu philosophers, they talk Sanskrit. But the philosophy which they taught is as fire and water. You know? Very, very different. So also in Europe, Schopenhauer and say Hegel, or you say David Hume, or you say Plato and Aristotle. So you see language more or less influences our thought structure, but it doesn't fix it 100%. It doesn't fix it neither in Europe, nor in India, nor in China. Otherwise, how to compare Lao Tse and Confucius? They took the help of Chinese language and developed two completely different philosophies. So the language, dependence on language is a necessary condition, but not sufficient condition to do philosophy. And then, of course, there are philosophers, they say, oh, but the non-European philosophers, they really don't argue. And my trouble is, and I normally talk to the students in seminar, the moment you define a philosophical argument, suppose you define a philosophical argument is a philosophical argument only when it convinces the others. Then the students just were wondering, then there has never been a philosophical argument in the history of philosophy, because no philosopher has ever been able to convince all other philosophers. So it is the hope of philosophical argument to convince, but it is not a defining characteristic of philosophical arguments. We expect to influence others or just to convince others, but it is not. And this particular way of defining philosophical argument you can realize everywhere. Buddha is the first anti-Hindu. Being himself a Hindu, he protested against Hindu orthodoxy. He was a type of Protestant. But this is happening nearly everywhere. The Europeans forget that at home they have the same type of fight. European philosophy is rationalist, anti-rationalist, skeptical, and whatnot. Or relativists. The trouble is, all the time it is said, non-European philosophy is more or very much relative to something. The trouble is, suppose, that is what I try to come to terms for myself actually. If to be a relativist, if to be a relativist means that we don't have the same idea of things like justice, knowledge, human rights and all that, then I personally wonder how can you be not a skeptic? Because we never have one particular idea of justice, knowledge, reality, metaphysics, ontology, and whatnot. So in that sense, relativism has some type of universalism in it. And that is the famous Jena logic, the seven valued Jena logic. They say everything what you say has a meaning. When we accept the point of view which you take, from some point of view, things are all right. But from another point of view, it is not. So this is a relativism in the sense of that only, the different types of spectacles. Philosophy has so many spectacles. But in the same way, you should have these different interpretations, so to say, of the same thing. So there is no one ontology, no one metaphysics, neither here nor there.
Yes, no, I think those were great points. But I think maybe it's interesting if I try to be the advocate of the devil here, just so we can have an interesting discussion. I think one of the points that someone could argue from a Eurocentric point of view when talking about arguments would be to say, no, it's not the case that an argument necessarily has to convince, but what they would mean that there is no such an argument, there's no such reasoned argument, which of course is also not true if you take into consideration the huge amount of discussions that you have in India and in China and so on. But I guess it would be a different point than saying, no, it's not that you have to convince, but you have to have some sort of reasoned argument. And one would argue often when talking about why philosophy is only of Western origin, of this idea that reason is something that, the concept of reason has only arisen somehow in Greece with philosophy, with Plato, and so on and so forth. That and that's what separates philosophy from myth and so on. That you have a sort of reasoned argument with which attempts to convince without relying to any sort of beliefs and so on. But not, of course, that I agree with any of that, but it's just to see. I would just like to know how you'd reply to that kind of argument, of saying that there is no such thing as a reasoned argument, in the way that we understand Europeanly what a reasoned argument is.
Because it's a myth to say that there is one. It's a myth to say that there is one European reason in philosophy. No, it's not. You just imagine, if take the case of Kant, or take the case of his criticism, Hume and Kant. So to say it's some type of ontologized reason. Kant's reason is one way of saying, and this is not the only reason. There are persons, they say, no, this is just a priori. The trouble is, philosophy could be done and should be done. Philosophy from above and philosophy from below. I personally tend to doing philosophy from below, not from above. But the transcendentalists, ontologists, and Platonists and all them, they know the real solution is already there. And then they try to press the facts according to this. That means empirical investigation has to accept the judgments of the a priori. And that is more or less one type of doing philosophy. Of course, if you tend towards that, then do it. But don't say this is the only way of doing philosophy. And that is where the trouble lies, and this trouble is nearly in all different traditions of philosophy. So there is no one European reason. Usually, what about the skeptics? What about other Greek philosophers who rejected Plato? You see, the whole of Middle Ages, human reason is nothing else but a copy of bodily reason. The Catholic philosophy, or the philosophy from this side. And even today, take the case of Karl Jaspers. It's a voluntative definition of reason. He says reason is a type of attendance to human affairs, and it is not something purely formal. So what you say, that is a claim, but there is no one European reason. So also the same thing in India also, the logic, different forms of logic. Take the case of Indian syllogism. Hardly any student, you do your BA and MA, and you have never heard that Indians have a syllogism, theory of syllogism, with 5 sentences, and not only with 3. But you have your MA and BA and whatnot, you have never heard of it. And this is also one theory of syllogistic thinking, with 5, and it is always with respect to the empirical element. That famous example is the Indians say, here all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. It is these 3 sentences. Indians would say the other way around, they just say the famous example is, on the mountain there is fire. Because there is smoke. The third one, see as in the kitchen. This is the empirical element. That is fire and, because fire and smoke, they are related. To be fiery and to be smoky, they go together. So this is a universal relation. But where is the empirical verification of this universal relation? And Indian syllogism always try to find out. As in the kitchen, there is smoke and there is fire. So wherever there is smoke, there is fire, but not the other way around. There may be fire without smoke. So I don't mean everybody should accept this theory of syllogism, empirically founded. Ganelli says is case-bound syllogism. But the students should know that there are other ways of talking syllogistically in other philosophical traditions. That is what I personally wish. To which you really tend to, that is your cup of tea, and that you can decide. And these are the things which should be there, And the trouble, I just read 2 weeks back, there is a book that has been translated in German. The book in English title is I'm Right, You Are Not. I think really somebody has written it. It's a very good book, very interesting book. I'm right, you are not. And that is these 2 valued logic. And that is the trouble. You have only 2 values, and that won't do. And this is there it is said, and that's why my students, I always try to say the best thing would be that you allow different ways of passing judgment on something. And which judgment really suits you, that depends on how you argue, or which argument really convinces you. That we talked in Vienna. You just make this experiment, a type of thought experiment. Suppose Hegel and Kant are here, and they give the lecture to us some 1 hour. And at the end, you say, Mr. Mal, Hegel convinces me more than Kant. And your friend tells you, no, Kant convinces me more than Hegel. Now try to find out, and that is my point of view, there is no convincing argument for this conviction. Kant is nearer to me than Hegel. And you tell me, no, Hegel is nearer to Kant. There is no deductive logic. That is, you understand German and or translation and all that, the Kant and Hegel, so we both heard 2 lectures. But ultimately, it happens. No, it happens to you that you were convinced by the argumentative structure of Kant, and I was convinced by the argumentative structure of Hegel. And there is no convincing logic for this conviction. It just happens. And this happens not only in aesthetics, and this happens in philosophy. Everybody is not Hegelian, everybody is not a Buddhist, everybody is not a Heideggerian. How come? So if there is a deductive logic in the philosophy of Heidegger or Buddha or not of you, then this deductive logic should apply. All men are mortal, I am man, I am mortal. But there is no such deductive logic. No? You read all these philosophers and it happens to you, oh no, Plato is better. I like Plato more. And you should try to find out there is no objective logic for this, I like Plato more. And that is where the trouble lies when you try to formalize reason in such a way, then we must say reason is only with Plato. And Aristotle will fight with his teacher. And it happened. There is no one European reason. There is also no one in India or Chinese.
Yes, well, first I don't know if anyone would like to comment something, otherwise we would just be talking here.
But you ask some questions, I want to learn from your side,
It's about something that I recognize as something more particularly Greek, about how you can use the word philosophy. I like your conception of philosophy. Whatever way I go with the word philosophy, this certain tendency of the spirit that you describe, I couldn't agree more. The question is about the particular word, the word philosophy. Because I think that by my limited contact with the text and mostly translations, I have come to believe that there is something that is of the Greek. It is something that the Greek tend to do. It's not a logical thing, but that the Greek tends to do, that we call philosophy more often. The first word for reason is not reason, that is the Roman translation. The word is logos. Simply means speech.
Yes,
Organized speech. So whatever from the text of the Greeks, whatever they come into contact, they try to make it all about speech.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, you could call it a philosophical reflex. As being born in Greece, you could call that, if you call only that philosophy, the attempt to describe everything in true words, that I have a little bit of I make a bit of a mess of this verb for to be, Greek is on.
Mm-hmm.
I think that has a meaning. They try to make the on, describe the on. I think that.
You are right. I mean, that is the famous criticism. Some 10 years back, I met Leopold Zeyer, and one of the very critical and very wise philosophers. And he said, he uses the word magistic reason of the Greek. And there he says, and that's really very true, the Greeks just said reason is what we just do. The barbarians, they stutter. We don't understand them. They just stutter. And that's why they don't have reason, no language. And then he said, but for the barbarians, Greeks were stuttering. Can you imagine? And this is the problem. And this is such a great truth, never spoken out. And he has written in his book that both of them, if I don't understand Chinese, then of course it is something, it's not there for me. But the other way around, like, the trouble is we must be very, very careful not to philolize the word reason. The word philosophy is Greek, but not what we do in the name of philosophy. Cooking is also an English word, a Chinese cook, Indian cook, African cook. So it is the activity which defines the noun and not the other way around. And that is very Wittgensteinian.
Yes.
So you just try to, what do we do when we do philosophy? Not all the time saying philosophy is a Greek word, of course. Darshan is also a Sanskrit word. So it is, don't philolize all the time. And that is the trouble. Always try to find what do we do when we do philosophy? What do we do when we cook? And there you will find there is some overlap in cooking. Chinese cooking is not French cooking, but cooking is cooking. And that is overlapping. And this overlapping is the only thing which binds us. Otherwise, only you search for identity. And this search for identity is very dictatorial. There is a theoretical, philosophical fundamentalism. The moment you say the way I understand Kant is not one way of understanding Kant, but it is the only way of understanding Kant. In one of my lectures I said, if somebody tells me before we talk on Kant, Mr. Mann, the way I understand Kant is not one way of understanding Kant in the manifold of Kant's understanding, but that is the understanding. Then I will tell him, let us go for a cup of coffee. Because it makes no sense. This is theoretical, philosophical fundamentalism. Because you don't allow me the way I read Kant, a priori you say that is not real Kant. And that won't do. This is against human right. And this is normally happens the moment you give a term, cooking or dancing, whatever it may be. So always try to find out some overlap, even interpersonal. And if the overlaps are if the overlap is very thin, then communication suffers. And if the overlaps are not there at all, and then Jaspers is right. Communications may break down, and they do break down. In life, everywhere. In politics, in philosophizing, everywhere they break down. But all that we should try, and that is the lecture which I topic the next Congress in the World Congress in Peking. There are three types of logic. Logic of identity. Logic of identity means you understand Kant only then and only then when you understand Kant the way I understand. And that is no wonder. It's no wonder. It's all right. Then if I have your spectacles, and then we see the world in the same way, this is normal. That is just so. This is logic of identity is full of violence, because logic of identity doesn't accept the other way of seeing things, and on the other hand, logic of complete difference doesn't allow any understanding at all. That is what the priests, when they were doing their missionary works in India or in, say, Latin America, they always say that is anything, but that is no religion. Buddhism was no religion, Hinduism was no religion, because they already defined religion in such a way that all other ways with overlap, they were no religion at all. So this is, and that is my topic, the logic of identity is dictatorial in theory and in practice. The trouble is, if a philosophical fundamentalist who is convinced of his theory completely, so philosophical mistakes, David Hume says, they are ridiculous. That is his word. Philosophical mistakes are ridiculous, but the moment they become practical, they are dangerous. And that is, you just take the case of this very, very harsh example, Hitler's book, my struggle. In the bookshelves of the Germans, Jews were living. So it was a theoretical fanaticism. And my job as a teacher of philosophy is that the students should get rid of this theoretical fanaticism. My Kant is one Kant in the plurality of Kants. And this is very democratic. Because the moment this theoretical fanaticism becomes practical, as Hitler's book, then it is too late. It is too late in politics, it is too late in every field of life, even interpersonal. And this is what, and that's why the proposal which I'm going to make, the only logic which helps us to manage in this world is logic of overlap. That the logic may be, if you take the case of dual logic, either or logic, two-valued logic, there are three-valued logic, there are multi-valued logic, the Jena philosophy in India, seven-valued logic. So logic, that is the overlap. So what we do in the name of logic, concretely, we do many things. But the overlap is we do logic. And there you can say a very logical argument, counter-arguments are arguments after all. Suppose Hegel and, that's my famous example, Hegel and Schopenhauer. If Hegel and Schopenhauer, they talk to each other, so of course, the only thing that can help them is that Hegel says, Schopenhauer, you do philosophize. And Schopenhauer should say, Hegel, you also philosophize. But the moment their philosophies take concrete form, they become like fire and water. They are completely different. But where do they meet? They meet in that they say, oh, you also philosophize. Suppose you are 100% staunch Kantian and I'm anti-Kantian. So where can we meet? So we should not fight on the second level, but only on the first level. Mr. Mal, you don't understand Kant the way I understand, and I don't understand Kant the way you understand, but we do interpret Kant. And the hermeneutic is, that's the few years back at in Rome, the Papal University, there was a topic like this, that religions which absolutize themselves, they are violent. And this is what would happen when you make one particular reading as the reading. Then of course there is no dialogue or there is no communication. And that's why there are two levels. Counter arguments are arguments after all. There we meet. But the moment counter arguments take a particular shape, then we are atheists and theists. But theists and atheists, suppose I talk to a theologian and he says, Mr. Mal, you are an atheist, leave it. So the man is already, before we talk, he started me, he puts me out. That means from the very beginning he says, the only way to talk about religion is to talk in the sense of theism. No, the overlap between theism and atheism is that theists and atheists give two readings of the world. Two readings. But the concrete shapes of these two readings are very contradictory. But they do read. That's the problem. I read Kant, although I don't read Kant the way you read, and the other way around. And if you don't accept it, what should you do? You become fanatic. So allow every reading of a text, except the reading which doesn't accept any other reading. That reading has to be fought against.
Yes. Well, I think in the spirit of the counter-argument, I will still try to keep being the advocate of the devil. But about his question, what he asked, which I think it was a really good question, but as far as I understood, what he was also questioning with bringing this issue of the logos and how the Greeks had this word has in a way of conceiving of the proper discourse about things, if that's.
No, I just meant that there is a particular thinking about activities. We're thinking about, if I'm understanding the spirit of the discourse, it's about the ways we relate with reality, with things around. You're calling something that is more universal philosophy. A general way to relate to discourse, to human relations. It is, you're calling something philosophy, and then manipulating the word, because you can manipulate words. You could manipulate words in such a way that philosophy is someone that wants to say that philosophy is a Greek concept. Because you can name that particular way to relate to things. That is to describe them exhaustively. Because the little contact I have to the Spanish or with the Buddhist tradition, they never fully describe. There is a point for the lack of full description. Of course, in West there is such traditions as well, but if you call it only Greek, they never stop. They never make reference to an experience such as at a certain point of meditation, the description stops. It is not important. Or you put names to full bundles of experience, which the Greek would try to break down. Or
But even so,
But not late antiquity, philosophy in Greece. I think Plato and Aristotle, yes, but the imperial period and not the end of Greek philosophy, such as Plotinus and the beginning of Christianity. They would do what Buddhists do.
of course.
and even
I don't know the
Plato.
late Christianity to the late antiquity, but Christianism, of course, this period goes in that direction. But for the more that imperial behavior that he's describing, call it the Dark Ages.
Let me give you one point that is very interesting. I did in one seminar in Wittgenstein. We normally complain that philosophy doesn't make any progress. So Plato said no progress. And then Wittgenstein says, what actually do you mean? Now he says, you just imagine, he gives sometimes very examples from the ground, from the earth, He says, we philosophize because there are problems. And that is very Buddhist, For the Greeks, it is wonder, that we philosophize. For the Indians, it is just ignorance, or it is just sorrow, sadness, That is life character. That is the starting point for philosophizing. The best way would be to accept both, and not singularize this one. Now, Wittgenstein says that when it itches, then I scratch. This thing, when it itches somewhere, then we scratch it. And then he says, when it itches, I scratch. But after some time, again it itches. Then again I scratch. Now he says, the bad habit of the philosophers is there are philosophers who say, and these are the transcendentalists, ideologists, yes, transcendentalists, a priorists, and all that, that philosophy from above, So he says, it itches as I scratch, it itches, I scratch, and the itching is coming all the time, returning back, and I am scratching. And this may go forever. But there are philosophers, they say, no, scratching is only scratching in the proper sense of the term when no itching comes back. See the wonder? This is magic. That you give a very formal, very analytic definitions are never wrong, but they have no information. So if you define real scratching in such a way that you say, Mr. Mal, when itching comes again, then it was not a real scratching. That means real philosophy is this and that. And that is what is, and Wittgenstein says, it may be that we just go on with this process. Problems are there, we try to solve them. Again the problems come, again we solve them, and what philosophers have been doing for the last 2,000-3,000 years, the same thing. The problems are there, and we always give some reasons. And this I have tried, the last book which I gave you, Filosofia Therapy, that is your book. Anyway, and there I've tried to say it may be, you know, I'm personally, if I should be person, I'm an active pessimist. And this is Schopenhauer, you know. And there's a big chapter, active pessimism. I never gave up, but I know heaven and earth is a dream. But I won't stop dreaming, but I won't ontologize this dream. It must come true, you know. That won't do. And it is in this sense that it may be that ultimately we stop by teaching. This is not very sad, you know. Only empirically I feel that ultimately before I die, it may be that I die with itching. I don't come to any scratching, which is heaven and nirvana or something. It's not pessimism. It happened, I'm all right now. But empirically it seems, I go on scratching and it will be itching, but it seems empirically it is more probable that I will die with itching. Something. But no, don't be pessimistic. Then not just go on scratching if it itches. And these examples should be taken seriously by the philosophers. And particularly those philosophers who do philosophy from above. You know that the last sentence, David Hume in his criticism says, and unexperienced, that is I quote him, an unexperienced reasoner is no reasoner at all. Unexperienced reasoner is no reasoner at all. That is, how can you reason when you have no experience? So experience the bedrock for philosophizing, not the other way around. All a priorists, they know from the very beginning things have to, empirical things, they have to follow the transcendental laws. I don't know how it will come. That's why I say the causality problem is never solved. And Hume is nearer, according to physics, Hume is nearer to the truth than Kant. So experience can't be neglected completely. And that is where, before you said, that is where Indian philosophy, particularly Indian philosophy, has two shapes. You know, there are two Sanskrit words. Knowledge has two functions: Gyan Prapti and Phal Prapti. Gyan means knowledge, and Phal means result or realization. That means realization in the sense of theoretical and also the practical. They go together. And European philosophy misunderstood that Indian philosophers just do the practical side of this. It is just practice and no theory. And it is theory, you know. You just imagine, majority of our students in the Western universities, they normally know there are two ways of getting knowledge. Experience and reason. Sometimes intuition. But these are the empiricism and rationalism. Indian epistemology has 6 different sources of knowledge. And this is really sad that our students don't know these things. 6 different ways of getting knowledge. Experience and reason are 2. And this is what majority, this is what really didn't happen. It didn't happen because of the political power, colonial power, you know. And it is just continuing all the time. That African philosophy, that is African studies. Indian philosophy, Indology should do it. This philolizing philosophy. That is some 20 years back when I was teaching at the University of Trier in Germany, a Japanese student of mine, she wanted to write a master's thesis on Nagarjuna with some philosophy, from the Middle Ages. I said, of course, I will supervise your thesis, doesn't matter. She went to the dean of the faculty and told him, Professor Mal is ready, what to do. You know what he told her? No, you can't do a master's thesis on Nagarjuna, go to the Indologist. You just imagine. And if I want to write a master's thesis on Hegel, should I go to the German department? This is the trouble. Now these things I can say in Germany for the last 30, 40 years because I'm not begging for something. I had my position. But this is really the situation. She couldn't write a master's thesis because that is a problem of the Indologists. And Hegel, no, that has to be done in philosophy departments. And this is the nonsense that Indian philosophy, or Russian, they are philolized completely. They reduce it. Indology is a very good science, but I'm very grateful to the Indologists, but at the same time very sad that they neglected the very philosophical, metaphysical, logical, dialectical part of Indian philosophy. They left it. It became too philological. And that is the saddest part of it. And this has to be changed. It will take time, and this is your job. Really, believe me. Because the students are internationalized today. Students are sometimes intuitively nearer the truth than European philosophers. Really. But they don't have any power, they can't change things. Intercultural philosophy in the intercultural history has to be institutionalized. It has to be institutionalized. Otherwise, it won't work. They will send you to the religious department, Asian studies, and whatnot, African studies, that's all. Anyway.
I wanted to share a bit of my experience, specifically here at Cyprus. I studied in my early years as a college student. I studied Buddhist philosophy on my own. That led me to in the end, to Japanese philosophy, contemporary Japanese philosophy. So the first thing that I experienced was, one of the things I experienced was that I tried to go to other philosophies. Specifically, in the beginning, I wanted to go to Buddhist philosophy in search of better answers, in search of something better. And when I taught, I had the chance once when I was doing my MA to teach Buddhist philosophy in Bogota, in my city, several years ago. That is a good sign, I think, in Latin America. That's another story, but it's interesting. And one of the things I experienced is that many of my students were young people from all the universities who had this mindset. They said, we think that Western philosophy failed, so we're going to Eastern philosophy for better answers. And then I realized that could be even a higher risk.
Right. Yes, you're right.
It is part of a romanticized image of the East. And what is the East anyway? And one of the things I told them was precisely that they should give up. They should try to criticize at least, self-criticize this image. And one of the signs, the interesting signs of why it would be good is that, for precisely, I was one of them. I was one of those young guys trying to look for better answers in the East. But then what I found is that I got to know the West better. I got to know my own tradition better. Yeah. Precisely, I think it is not incidental that Hegel was probably the most influential thinker in the image, in fixing this idea that philosophy is only European. Because I think he was also very influential in the idea of Western philosophy that we have today, the idea that around which departments organize.
Yes,
because precisely Hegel did not only believe that Indian philosophy, for example, was not philosophy. He also left out most of Western philosophy.
Yes.
And when I went back to find what was there, then I realized interesting things. For example, that the language that's the position of a professor in Barcelona, Amador Vega, that's his name. He says that most of the vocabulary that helped to shape modern German philosophy was coined by Meister Eckhart and other mystical thinkers in the 14th century. That's something that, but isn't that not supposed to be religious? Is that not supposed to be something else but philosophy? Then I realized it's more the image. I mean, Western philosophy is much more than what we usually think as philosophy, and probably it's much more than description. It's not only, it doesn't have to be descriptive. But I also think that there are, well, if it's about description, you can also see exhaustive description, probably the most exhaustive descriptions of mind factors. You will find them in Indian philosophy, in Buddhist philosophy, in Nyaya school had a very exhaustive theory of knowledge. And the Abhidharma exhibits a very exhaustive catalog of existing things, organized in a very systematic way. So it's like the picture is much more complex, and that's one of the things I got.
Thank you so much for your comments. You know, that is what the trouble is. We should not aesthetize the whole thing. Just a story. Some 8 years back, I got a guest professorship at the University of Bombay. There are Indians, there are Pandits. They sit in Varanasi and try. Philosophy is darshan, and that is the only philosophy. This is the same one-eyed, to be one-eyed. And in one of the discussions, one professor told me, and he was teaching Vedanta philosophy and all that. He said, "But Mr. Mark, all right, you have been teaching in Europe for so many years, but philosophy proper is darshan. That is just Indian philosophy." I said, "You just imagine. For the last 35 years, I'm fighting just against that, and you are making the same mistake." And you are 100% right. This studying philosophy in its homelessness would help us within our own tradition of philosophy. So I personally never make these mistakes. But this thing now, many Indians believe philosophy proper is just Indian philosophy, Atman, Brahman and all that. But that is not accepted in India even. But the same thing happened in Europe also. Everybody is not a transcendentalist. Everybody is not an empiricist. So this aesthetization, we must be very, very careful. And that is happening at present. Sometimes. Many students, it is somehow we are so unhappy. Romanticism, romantic philosophers or thinkers, they just went to India, they were so fed up with Europe, they thought India can help us. And all of a sudden, they found so, and this romanticism is still there. It is there. And they forget, as you said, Indian epistemology is very rich.
I would also like to add regarding this, what Carlos and what's your name?
Mark.
And what Marco said. Also, when it comes to this definition of, on this question of the philosophy and whether this comes to attempting an exhaustive description or not, and Plato, and what Plato was trying to do or not, I believe even today there are interpretations that argue that even in Plato you have a conception of the good or of the idea of the good, which is ultimately in some sense mystical, in a way that it can't really be described, it can't be expressed, it can only be experienced. But moreover, it's kind of funny how we always forget what the origin of the term philosophy is, because it isn't with Plato, it's with Pythagoras. And he isn't exactly known for being such a non-mystical guy, He was very connected with, and also connected with Eastern tradition, which is also interesting. So I think there's a point to be made there that even this no matter how old it is, this self-comprehension of a Western philosopher, of what philosophy is, can be mistaken, can even about himself, because there is also this whole discussion of whether the separation from reason and myth, and then someone will say, Plato tried to separate himself from myth, but ultimately he didn't manage to do that because he still relies on myths, he still is connected to mythical thinking. So I would also add the point that it's not because one offers, even if a Greek in its origin defines philosophy as something, it doesn't mean that he owns this word to begin with, or that he has even the unique or the absolutely right comprehension of what he is doing there. Because one can say, no, but see, what he's doing there is actually different. It's not entirely what he's describing. And there's something there which actually has in common to other traditions and other things, which is what we could call philosophy. rather than this exhaustive description aspect. But even then, as Carlos said, you can find plenty of examples in Indian philosophy, also in Chinese philosophy, of philosophies which not only are preoccupied with describing things exhaustively, but also believe that is sufficient. You have the Sankhya, the classical Sankhya tradition, where you get enlightenment by enumerating the aspects of reality. And once you get this full knowledge of the classification, when you truly grasp it, you reach moksha, you reach liberation. You don't need anything further than this discrimination, than this exhaustive description of reality. So it's more to make this point that we shouldn't be convinced, no matter how old the conception is or how original the conception is of what philosophy is, that conception itself describes better what's happening there, or is the only possible description of what those thinkers are doing.
There is one sentence only. There is a very convincing argument by the phenomenologist and philosophical anthropologist Helmut Plessner, this philosopher. He says there is an undecidability of the definition of philosophy. Because the definition of philosophy doesn't fall down from heaven. That means how philosophy should be defined, philosophy doesn't tell us. We have to find out what philosophy really means. And what we do in the name of philosophy is very different thing. That means to do philosophy in a different way is not to do no philosophy, but to do philosophy in a different way, to realize philosophy in a different way. And that is the difference. If I cook in a different way than the French, then you can say, of course, Mr. Man, you are cooking in a different way. But if the man tells me, no, you are not cooking at all, that is nonsense. That should be avoided. So there is an undecidability of the definition of philosophy. And that is in India, that is also in Europe, that is everywhere. Because it is, philosophers should give a definition to philosophy. Philosophy doesn't tell us what it is. How can? And suppose you propose a definition, you are not certain that I'm going to accept this proposal. And this is what is happening every day, that European philosophy has so many definitions, Indian philosophy, everywhere. And that's why nominal definitions are very sober and very clean, but they are not informative. So that is where, and that's why I'm talking personally, for me, only overlap can help us. And that is very democratic. Otherwise, every reading will be dictatorial. So all that I can say, if my doctor father says, no, if you don't understand Kant the way I tell you to understand, then you can't do your doctorate. Then of course, then I will just try my tricks. Then I will just tell a lie. I say, oh my professor, your reading is the best reading. And this normally happens in life, in business and everywhere. What should I do with my doctor father, as the Germans say, if the man says, no, that is not Kant, the way you understand. If I'm interested in doing my doctorate, I should somehow tell a lie. But there is a limit to this telling lie. And that's why the best way not to formalize definitions in such a way that dancing is just dancing the way I define it. Yet, but give me the same freedom to define the freedom which you take for granted for you. Why don't you give me the same freedom to me? For that, political power can decide, and that is not our problem.
Would anyone else? Yes. Anyone else would like to make a comment, a question? So?
I'm trying to be quick. Just that precisely what you say raises a question in my mind. I understand. I tend to agree with you that a close definition won't do. But at the same time, it is also a point that we need an understanding, even if it is not in the form of a formal definition. We need an understanding of what we do as philosophy. Take the example of cooking.
Yeah.
Of course, if I cook in a different way, and then someone tells me, well, you're not cooking, then it's like, no way. I'm cooking in a different way. But if I just put the ingredients in the pot, and then I just don't put on the stove or anything, just leave the ingredients there, they will rot. They will rot.
Yes,
So to take the extreme example, the case of philosophy, for example, I heard a story. I don't know if it's right, but I heard a story that Derek Parfit's texts were being recited by a community of Buddhist monks in, I don't know if it was in Burma.
Yes,
I found it interesting. But I would say that those monks are not doing philosophy. I would say it's not philosophy, it's a philosophical text. But just reciting the text would not do, because you're not thinking. I mean, they're not thinking or trying to understand it by themselves. So there is at least something, it's not enough for a definition, but there are some things that we somehow can precisely define as, well, not a close definition, but still we need to have an understanding of what philosophy is in order to tell, well, this is not philosophy proper, this could be philosophy. This has to be engaged with this as philosophy. So how can we address that?
Yeah, but there I think you can take the help of, that is where I take the help from Wittgenstein. There is some form of family resemblance. It is working. It is at work. Some family resemblance, but family resemblance are never identity. Suppose I have one brother, two sisters, so there is a family resemblance. Maybe nose, there is a resemblance, but the ears, they don't resemble. There is some difference. No? The family resemblance is the only thing which can help us. But this family resemblance is no ontology. It is not total identity. No? So the moment you say it is no cooking, that of course you should know, but you say it will rot if you leave it there. Of course the cooking needs a cook. You know, all comparisons, they are very lame. They break down at a point, all comparisons. And the case of the Buddhists, all that. Of course in Buddhism, when it becomes a mantra, you know, then of course it has nothing to do with Nagarjuna. It has nothing to do with philosophy proper. No? That means Buddhist philosophy, that is what I have done in my book on Nagarjuna, read interculturally. That is what I have, just a small book, you know. So Buddhist philosophy in that way, without religion, Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist logic can stand on its own. That Indian philosophy can stand as philosophy on its own. But Indian philosophy is always a tendency to free us, you know, in the sense of nirvana or mukti or moksha or something like this. So this is a part of Indian philosophy. But Indian philosophy as philosophy remains philosophy without this soteriological element. Only in European philosophy, with the dawn of Christianity, you know, for the Greeks and for the Romans, philosophy was a way of thought and way of life. It was with them. And the moment Christianity came into power, what has happened is that, no, the only truth which can free us is the religious truth. But in India, such thing never happened. You know, Buddhism and Hinduism and all other different ways, and that's why Indian philosophy kept two things together, a way of thought and a way of life. But it can remain on its own as a way of thought. I may not believe in karma, I may not believe in nirvana and all that, but still I can do Indian philosophy as philosophy proper. Because there is no cut in Indian history, in the history of Indian thought, where religion just said no. The only truth which can free you is the religious truth. In India it never happened, because Buddhism and Hinduism, they just existed side by side. And this is what happened in Europe with the dawn of Christianity. That's why soteriology, that has nothing to do with philosophy. That I must tell you, Indian philosophy does keep this dream as philosophy, but it is not necessarily a part of Indian philosophy proper. Indian logic stands on its own. As you just said, epistemology, very rich epistemology stands on its own. Nyaya philosophy is not theistic. Sankhya is not theistic. And the Indian materialism, of course, completely atheistic. And that is what students should know, that Indian philosophy is not just identical to soteriology. No, it is a part of it. Yeah? It can stand without it. Yeah? And that is what I try to do. And soteriology, that of course, then if I sit and do yoga, that is my cup of tea. But it is not philosophy proper. Philosophy can just show us the way. So also Nagarjuna. But it is not nirvana as such. And that's why in my book I have tried today, by Nagarjuna, I think there is a very beautiful sentence that is that if you realize shunyata karuna garva, if you realize shunyata, then you realize karuna. That means this. What is karuna would be a type of
Compassion is
yes, that means a type of relatedness to the whole of whole creation of that. Now, the trouble is how to understand it. If I realize shunyata, emptiness, does it mean that I necessarily become a Buddha? Not necessarily. Because the moment you say no, if you say, Mr. Mal, the moment you realize emptiness, you become a Buddhist. And if I say no, I realize it, but I am not, then you have two ways of arguing logically. One would be, no, you didn't realize it. And that is the trouble from the Greek philosophy, wisdom and knowledge. It is said, if you know what is good, then you do what is good. And now you see the trick. If you say, if you know what is good, then you do what is good. And then I say, but see, empirically, there are many persons, they know what is good, but they do what is not good. Then you can say very logically and clearly, nay, then you don't know what is good. That means within the definition of good, you import to do good. And that is an analytic sentence. And that may happen also in the case of Buddhist philosophy. So to know good is a necessary condition to do good, but not sufficient. We know what is good, but fail to do what is good because of so many other reasons. And that is where yoga philosophy is a very big help. Yoga metaphysics, so to say. That is the way of practicing it. So we should be very, very careful not to formalize arguments so purely that you can of course say, no, that then you don't know what is good. Because in the definition of good, you have already imported the activity to do good. And that is an analytic sentence, it is not a synthetic one. Can't it be happen? And everybody knows that many of us know what is good, but somehow we fail to do it because of different other reasons. It may be personal, or it may be different kleshas, as the yoga philosophers. I'm very, in the beginning I was quite happy with clear definitions. But clear definitions are just a type of senseless magic. They really don't help when it comes to empirical truth or fact. Then you simply wonder. And that's why it is said, idealists are ultimately very tragic figures because they fail to realize it. I'm reading a book at present, and it is a Marx in the last days of his life. He said, I am the only non-Marxist in the world. So the moment you become too ideological, we normally suffer because the empirical world is full of thorns. Inevitably, otherwise you will become very pessimistic.
Anyone else want to ask a question, make a comment? Well, then I would just like to add to what you said about Indian philosophy, because I think that's a very important point on this discussion of whether you have some sort of rational argument or logical argument because sometimes people even people who study Eastern philosophies in a way, I would say, or that have an interest in it, would say something like, no, but what you have here is something that you have to experience, not to think about, not to discuss. But actually, while it's indeed always mostly true that in Indian philosophies you have to go one step beyond discourse at some point. At some point you have to go to a non-conceptual level, a non-conceptual experience. It's never the case that everything that you are discussing earlier, the discourse that you formulate, requires this previous experience. Because on the contrary, this discourse has precisely the purpose of managing to get you there. So it can't presuppose that you already have the experience that it's trying to point you to. So I think that would argue in favor of precisely of what you said, that the philosophy is self-sufficient because it can't presuppose this experience precisely because it's meant to lead to it. So it has to be an independent means of argument, I would say.
Yes, I don't know whether I understand you correctly, but to define the real nature of philosophical argument is a philosophical problem. It is not decided beforehand. What is a philosophical rational argument? You just ask Kant, Hume, William James, and Wittgenstein, and whatnot. So they give different answers of what a philosophical argument is. So a philosophical argument is a proposal. And we just try to define this proposal in so many different ways. That means there is no singularity of the definition of philosophical argument. And if there is such a one, then you tell me whose philosophical definition of philosophical argument is the definition of the philosophical argument. Then you have so many candidates, from Plato up to Kant, and in India also. That means that there are philosophical arguments as arguments. But the moment we give these arguments a shape, then they become. And that's why, there is, before the interpretation, texts are very chaste. In English, we only use the word chastity of meaning. So before the interpretation, texts have a meaning, but we don't know which meaning. So this is just a referent. Only after the interpretation we know what Hegel means. Before the interpretation, we only know, Hegel means something. Before the interpretation, the texts have a meaning. We don't know which. Only after the interpretation, we have different meanings. So it is very much a type of something like the case of the fall in religion. Before the fall, so to say, when Adam and Eve, they were very pure and sincere, but they didn't know about the moment they fell down, and then it became the reality. So one should be very, very careful that after the interpretation we know what a text means. Before the interpretation, we have only the text, not the interpretation. So also the Bible, it will become Hegel, right Hegelians and left Hegelians. Both the groups were Germans, but still they were fighting with two interpretations of Hegel. Now who understood Hegel better? So these are two interpretations. Hegel meant something that is overlapping, but what he really meant, we know after the interpretation, not before the interpretation. That is a type of logical referent. Before the interpretation, the Holy Scripture. Before the interpretation, Plato means something. But God knows, before the interpretation we don't know. But the moment we interpret, there is a pluralistic hermeneutic. All of a sudden we have so many Heideggers, so many Platos, and so many Nagarjunas. And we have to manage. The deep tendency just to find the truth in singularity is very dangerous. And the moment your singularity, you want to universalize it, that is worse. Singularization is already something not very welcome. But if your singularity becomes universal, then it is very dangerous. So plurality of interpretation is a fact. And if we suffer because there are so many interpretations, then this is my mistake. And that is where one should do with the students. I did some 30 years back. I said, you do some type of intellectual yoga. Get rid of this greed that my interpretation is the only interpretation. And this you can do some type of intellectual yoga. Yoga means just to get rid of this fanaticism, logical, philosophical. Oh, my interpretation is not one interpretation in the democracy of interpretation. No, it is the. And this is a characteristic. Philosophically, it's a characteristic. And how to get rid of this characteristic? To say, no, you are also interpreting, and I too. So let us manage to live together with two interpretations or three interpretations. And if I suffer, it is my cup of tea. It is not your cup of tea. So one has to develop a culture of tolerating plurality. Only no one view should be dictatorial. That is the only thing. And everybody wants to rule the world from one point of view. You want it, I want it, but we both can't manage it. So only the overlap could help us, and that is also even personal life, husband, wife, friends, and that. It always happens, only sometimes we cover it. Because we don't want to go that far, but when we philosophize, we just want to get the truth in singular. It has never been in singularity. Singularity is only, and that is Husserl, a type of noematic relation. It is just a type of noema. In dream, there is something I dream of. When I hate, there is something to be hated. So this noema is there, and in that sense, God is a noema. Husserl said, although he was a believing Protestant. So noematic, in that sense, I accept personally that there is some something. But the moment you say, no, this noematic relation has been realized in my particular system, that will do. That is dictatorship in thinking.
Well, then I would just like to ask one question regarding this plurality of interpretations, because I find it interesting that you say, well, when we go from the starting point that you only understood me if you agree with me, then we should just go have a cup of coffee, because none of us is going to be able to talk to each other. But on the other hand, assuming this plurality, assuming that no one can claim to have the truth for oneself alone, how is it possible yet that we can talk to each other and try to convince each other? By means of what could we possibly convince each other in the case that we come from different convictions, or that we have different presuppositions, but yet how is it possible, if that is the case, if it's true that there's this pluralistic situation, but if at the same time we should be able to talk to each other, and that should mean something, that should be capable of communicating something, maybe even changing the other's position. In what way would that be possible exactly?
Yes, in that case, I would just pray for that some good luck happens, that we meet. But anyway, that is side by side. We just say conscience, dissent, and compromise. And that is the big trouble, between Habermas and the postmodern thinkers. They just say, no, there is nothing like this. There is always some form of force in every discussion. And Habermas is just idealizing rather too much the conscience. So I personally feel, and that in my practice for the last 40 years, that also in a different language, in a different country. To live in a different country, in a different language, it is a very frustrating and enriching experience. And this is really, believe me, I'm richer here in Germany, in Europe, but at the same time became poorer. And this experience is normally everywhere, even within the same country. No? Persons coming from the northern Brazil and the south Brazil, they may not feel at home. No? This may happen everywhere. So my answer would be that conscience, dissens, I personally believe dissens is more original than conscience. Conscience or consensus is something which we aim at, and dissens is something which is there, the difference. And that is where the postmodern thinkers are nearer to the truth, dissens. So all that would help us is to find some form of compromise. That means compromise is the only way out, and compromise will give some pain. But the pain is because I wanted my view to be the only view. And this intellectual mistake, so to say, intellectual ethical mistake, moral mistake, this has to be corrected. And if we say, no, compromise, that is not my cup of tea, then let us fight. That is the trouble, Without compromise, it can't be possible. You have to give in. Only these compromises which you get into, or which you realize, they should not be dirty, should not be foul. Majority of the compromises, they are very foul. They are not really, we just give in. So try to realize compromise which are more or less grounded. They don't pain us, but compromise will always ask me to give up some of my claims. Otherwise, nothing is there. You should be happy. Mahatma Gandhi said once in discussion with the theologians in Christians, he said, my mother, for me, I quote Gandhi, my mother for me is the best and the most beautiful, but your mother for you also. And this is the overlap. Don't say, since my mother for me is the most beautiful lady, your mother can't be. This is dictatorship. That won't do. And this leads us to some type of compromise. And that is good. But compromise will always mean to give up some of my claims. Because you give up and I give up. And if we suffer, it is a part of life. It has to. Because we are not a monad, like yes. The one big monad. Everything is over.
Well, then let me keep going. But would you think further that not only we can compromise, but we can also at some point convince each other? I mean, is there a scenario where I can convince
Another person
of my own position? And if that is possible, how is it possible if we assume that we have such different standpoints? How can someone convince me, and how can I adopt his view?
Real conversions are possible. There are Catholics who became Protestants in the other ways around. Hindus, Buddhists. Conscience became Hegelians, and Hegelians conscience. That is possible. That is true. That is a real conversion. But that would happen when your arguments convince me so much that I see to it that my interpretation was completely wrong, but not under pressure.
Yes.
Your argument must convince me, and you should not press me to accept your arguments. There, of course, a real conversion in religion, in philosophy. You just take the case of Haber, not Habermas, Karl Popper and his student. What was his name? Feyerabend. Feyerabend. Karl Popper and Feyerabend, his students. Feyerabend was just a friend of Popper. He liked him like anything. And later on in the book, Against Method, he just said, no, it is all nonsense what Popper says. A Popperian became anti-Popper. That is possible. But it should not take place under some pressure.
Yes.
But real conversion in philosophy, in personal life, is a possibility, it is a reality. It really happens.
And actually, Feyerabend was also was a very close friend to Lakatos, which was a very strong Popperian. I think it's a very good example of what you mean by dissent by an open and even friendly dissent, because they both couldn't disagree more with each other, but they were really close friends.
Of course, that could be in the same case with Buddha. He met some 3 or 4 Indian yogis and wanted to get to nirvana. And these Indian yogis always asked Buddha, "Come on, did you get it?" Buddha said, "No, no." So the only sincerity in case of Buddha was, "No, I don't realize what you formalizes too much." That means this ethic is not existing here on earth. It is somewhere else. And when there are needs, we do make mistakes. So intellectuality without the ethical part of it won't do ultimately, believe me. Believe me, I believe it. Because ethical behavior is a part of this intellectual sincerity. Otherwise, intellectual sincerity becomes so barren. Such barren, it produces nothing. It is clean, just analytical.
So, if no one else would like to make any comment, I think we can close the section for today. So, thank you very much, Professor.
I have to thank you. I have to thank you all.
We'll continue tomorrow. The mini course will take place at the same hour, 4:30 here. And before, we are also going. The next section of the congress is going to be a communication section on Japanese aesthetics. So at 8:15 in the morning.